Welcome to From the Mind of Christine McConnell. We are back doing a really neat episode. We're going to be recovering an antique parasol. So I was up in the attic and I was, cleaning and shuffling things around when I uncovered this really tattered old, I think it's an umbrella technically, but we're going to make it a parasol. It belonged to one of the original family members. I mentioned before there was a husband and wife who had the house built. They had 4 children, only one son. His name was Arleigh Richardson, and his initials are scratched into the handle of this, which would date this to about 1880, I think, which is like 140 years old. So we are going to totally give this thing a makeover. It's going to be incredible, but we're going to start by stripping it down to its bones first. The element that made me question if this was ever actually used as an umbrella is that it is covered in cotton, which doesn't seem like it would protect you from like a heavy downpour, but I'm not well versed enough in antique umbrellas and parasols to say with any certainty if it was one or the other, but we will be turning it into a parasol today. The very first step is possibly the easiest of this entire project, and that is removing this cotton from the original structure. Because it is so old, the threads that are, connecting it are so brittle that just the tiniest bit of manipulation are easily detaching it. To determine the exact original pattern, I'm going to have to go in and very delicately take apart one of the panels, and you can't just pull it or cut it. You kind of have to go in and snip each individual thread to ensure that you don't in any way distort the pattern. Once you've fully removed a single panel, you need to iron it out and then lay it down on some sort of like cardstock or really thick paper, and that will end up being your template. I didn't unfurl the rolled edge at the bottom of that panel, so here I'm just adding an allowance to my pattern. So now it's time to mend the mechanism of this umbrella. These seem really complicated, but once you actually get into looking at them, it's a fairly simple sort of way that they come together. Even if you find yourself working on one that maybe has like a piece or two that are broken beyond repair, you can usually find an even worse off umbrella and Frankenstein a few pieces of that to make yours whole. Luckily with this one, there's only a few little things messed up. It's mainly up at the neck of this where the tines come together. There's a metal band basically that holds everything together, and it's rusted and fallen apart. So we're just going to replace that and then see what else this needs. If this part is something you end up having to tackle on something you're working on, I would suggest having several gauges of wire so you can experiment. It shouldn't be so thick that you can't easily move the tines back and forth across it, but it also should be thick enough that it's super sturdy and is going to hold in place. Okay, so now we're going to create a pattern for this. Typically when I've done this in the past, it's been so simple. You just, take a piece, the only solid piece you have from the original, iron it out, and then duplicate that pattern over and over again. And that's really a simple, easy way to do this, and it will look very beautiful if that's what you do. But I want to make this as hard as I possibly can. So, and that's kind of what these episodes are about, is let's see how artsy and fun we can get with these. So that is what I'm going to be attempting here, and let's see how that goes. This has become one of my favorite methods for sketching something out that's an original creation, is I just draw half of it, and then once I have something that I'm kind of happy with, I just lay trace paper over that, mark it with a pencil. Then once you've done that, you just flip it upside down and you just mark over all of those lines that you've drawn on the opposite side, and it leaves kind of a mirrored imprint of what you've drawn. So let's take a little break here, and I'm going to explain how I'm creating this, because obviously filming it is a little bit tricky to tell the story that you need to convey. There are 7 panels all the way around, and I'm obviously creating a creature here in the front that's going to have wings that go around the back. So obviously that first one is totally unique. You only have to do 1 of those, but for the remaining 6, you only need to do 3 more designs, and then you can mirror those on each side. So you're just really designing a total of 4 panels. I want my finished parasol to look like it has essentially bat wings wrapping around it, gradually getting smaller. And then to tie all of the panels together and really give this some continuity, I'm doing these decorative little embellishments that will go on each and every panel going around the parasol. Now that I'm happy with all of my designs, I'm going to mark each one so I can keep track of things, and then take a razor blade and start cutting out all of these shapes so I can use them as pattern pieces. On the decorative little embellishments, you only need to cut out 1 copy of each of these, and then you can just use that on every panel. So now that we have a pattern we're happy with, it's time to prepare our fabric. I have a 100% cotton here that I'm going to be dyeing into 2 shades of brown, 1 lighter and 1 darker. Dyeing anything brown is incredibly difficult because so many of the pre-packaged dyes want to go super red, and you really don't want that. So I use red incredibly sparingly, and then I just add a ton of yellow to my dye bath. I realize this looks like this happened really quickly, but I honestly spent almost 2 days trying to get this color exactly right. All right, that took a minute, but I am very happy with the finished results. If you live close to a store that has a ton of options, honestly, you're gonna be happier if you just go pick out the colors that you want. But if you're far away from those locations like I am, this is a great alternative option. So now that we're good to go on this, let's start cutting out our pieces. For any of the edges where I've actually cut across the panel, I need to add about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and that way I'm able to sort of sew those pieces together and not distort the pattern at all. One big thing you will notice in this episode is Professor Poof and Archimedes are shedding like crazy right now. It must be the time of year. And I did everything I could and could not keep their fur off of the project while I was working on it. So at the very end, I use a lint roller, but anticipate seeing lots of little bits of my kitties on this project as we work. These are the areas that I added that additional seam allowance where it cuts across the panel. And now I'm going to pin them together. You don't want to create any tension. They should just be laying together very smoothly. And then you can just sew it together from there. Now it's time to start working on the bat panel. This is going to look so hard and complicated, but it's really kind of not. If you ever made paper dolls when you were little, or you're familiar with that process, it's really similar to that. So long as every piece that's going to join something else has about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and you mark everything with this disappearing ink, it's going to kind of line up. You do, I think you should, baste stitch, which is kind of like a temporary stitch, all the way around first, and start at the center. That's also really important. Just it makes things sort of come together evenly. So baste stitching is a great first step, and then once you're happy with how the pieces are sort of aligning, you can go in with the sewing machine and make those stitches permanent. I'm going to happily admit I was intimidated to do this part. It's really delicate, and if it's not done right, it's gonna look wrong. And then I sort of stopped and I realized there isn't any reason it won't work out. You just have to take your time and be very patient. So that is kind of my best advice, is if you are tackling something just like this, just take your time, go very slowly, and it will work out in the end. My basting stitching is all done now, and it's time to start sewing this together. And then once that's done, I can iron it out and see what the end result's gonna be. I'm going to be adding a lace panel behind this cutout, but before I do that, I need to cut some relief marks into my seam allowance. Once that was done, I ironed it underneath, so it created kind of a really smooth little transition, laid the lace panel over the back, and then I'm taking some tearaway stabilizer paper, which you can attach by just running an iron over very quickly, and that just keeps everything in place while you do your stitching. Once you're done, you can just tear away that stabilizing paper and trim the lace up to the seam, and then you just hand stitch that seam so it looks nice and clean. Now let me show you how I create a really clean looking rolled hem. You can start by just sewing a line about 1/8 inch away from the edge of the fabric. Then on an ironing board, fold over that little bit of extra fabric and iron it down to get it to lay perfectly flat. And that first line of stitching that we just did should sort of be the edge at this particular moment. Then at your sewing machine, you just very carefully roll that over and pin it underneath the foot, and you just keep folding it as you run it underneath the machine. run over it once more with the iron to set it in, and there you have a really clean looking rolled hem. Our panels are all done, and now it's time to start embroidery. This is a process that can be as complicated or simple as you want to make it. I attempted to do some of this on the sewing machine, and it just immediately was clear that that wasn't going to work. Doing it by hand just sort of yields a better looking result. So if you have a good audiobook and a good amount of time, this process can be really calm and enjoyable. I'm beginning the process by taking a fine point disappearing ink pen and using that stencil that we created earlier to make some initial marks, and then I'm going to go in and complete the pattern. A really great trick that I've developed for doing embellishment on sort of an edge that won't fit into a normal loop is to take some of this tearaway stabilizer, iron it on, and then you can actually still press a hoop right behind it, and it locks it in place and keeps the fabric nice and taut. I personally really enjoy embroidering with just standard all-purpose thread because I just feel that it allows you to get really fine details. This hole that I'm cutting out is going to be what's called an eyelet. And the way I create these is I just do a standard stitch all the way around, the perimeter of that cavity, cut out the fabric inside, and then I just do a hoop stitch from the outside in all the way around, kind of like a buttonhole. When embroidering, anytime you finish off a bit of thread, you do always want to either tie it off completely or tie it onto the next thread that you're using, just because you don't want any of this embroidery coming apart. If you find that any of your disappearing ink is lingering and you want it to go away, all you have to do is take a little bit of a cloth saturated with water and dampen it down, and then once it dries, the ink will be gone. All of this embroidery had to be done on 7 complete panels, and oh my gosh, did it take a long time to do. Just this little tiny section that you see here takes me about an hour and a half to embroider, so you just do the math. It takes a long time, but this is kind of a passion project for me, and I just feel like you should enjoy the hobbies that you engage in, and even if they take a long time, I still feel like it's fun. And here is the greatest fur distributing culprit I have in my entire house. He is so wonderful and sweet, but he never bothers to clean himself. He just waits until I do it for him, and he is very happy to be taken care of. To create my little character's face here, I'm just going to start by outlining everything in a pretty neutral color, and then you can go in and start mixing shades and go very slowly. I bought probably around 20 different colors of thread just to sort of play with and find the right fit for every little area I was working on. I think we're now ready to start bringing these pieces together. I start off everything by just running a straight stitch along the edges of each of the panels that are going to be pulled together. And then once I do that, I lay everything down and make sure every piece is finding its partner. Again, when you're pinning these, you want to make sure there is no tension. They should just lay right next to each other. Once everything is joined, you want to hand stitch around the edge of that ring at the top just to make sure that it is nice and sturdy. Back inside, I'm going to run over these edges with a finishing stitch, and then I'm even going to roll them over and do one last stitch to make sure this is nice and taut. At the points at the bottom, you're probably going to need to snip away any of the excess fabric that's gathered up underneath, and then just run over it with a bit of thread by hand, wrap it around the edge, and then pierce it through again with the needle, and that will give you a nice, clean looking finished end. You definitely don't want to forget about these protective rings that go in between the tines and your finished piece, and what they do is they prevent that mechanism that works so often from catching, the decorative fabric on the exterior, and they just help to keep everything looking tidy. The end of one of my tines had rusted and broken away, and so I've just got to file this down, and I'm just borrowing a little end from another umbrella, and there's no glue or adhesive needed. The tension will keep that in place. To ensure that everything stays aligned, you do want to do about 3 stitches up the length of each of the tines, connecting the seam to its proper partner. It's all finished and I'm beyond thrilled with how this came out. I was willing to spend, so much time fiddling with it and getting it perfect, and it just surpassed anything I expected as far as the end result goes. One thing I should tell you is if we ever, move from this house, I have to leave it here because technically it sort of belongs to the house. So just something to keep in mind if you ever restore something that comes from a historic place. So coming up this month, we are doing some really exciting projects. I'm only going to hint that they're happening in the attic and they should be coming soon. So stay tuned, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you again very soon.